The Disinterment of Venus by Clark Ashton Smith. Chapter 1. Prior to certain highly deplorable and scandalous happenings in the year 1550, the vegetable garden of Phrygian was situated on the southeast side of the abbey. After these events, it was removed to the northwest side, where it has remained ever since, and the former garden site was given to weeds and briars, which, by strict order of the successive abbots, no one has ever tried to eradicate or curb. The happenings which compelled this removal of the Benedictines' turnip and carrot patches became a popular tale in Aveyron, to the lasting shame of the good brothers. It is hard to say how much or how little of the legend is apocryphal. One April morning, 3 monks were spading lustily in the garden. Their names were Paul, Pierre, and Hugh. The first was a man of ripe years, hale and robust. The second was in his early prime. The third was little more than a boy, and had but recently taken his final vows. Being moved with an especial ardor, in which the vernal stirring of youthful sap may have played its part, Hugh proceeded to dig the loamy soil even more diligently and deeply than his comrades. The ground was almost free of stones, owing to the careful and industrious tillage of many generations of monks. But anon, through the muscular zeal with which it was wielded, the spade of Hugh encountered a well-buried object of indeterminate size but unquestionable hardness. Hugh felt that this obstruction, which in all likelihood was a small boulder, should be removed for the honor of the monastery and the glory of God. Bending busily, he shoveled away the moist, blackish loam in an effort to uncover it. The task was more arduous than he had expected, and the supposed boulder began to reveal an amazing length and a quite singular formation as he bared it by degrees. Leaving their own toil, Pierre and Paul came to his assistance. Soon, through the zealous endeavors of the three, the nature of the buried object became all too manifest. In the large pit they had now dug, the monks beheld the grimy head and torso of what was plainly a marble woman or goddess from antique years. The pale stone of shoulders and arms, tinged faintly as if with a living rose, had been scraped clean in places by their delving shovels, but the face and breasts were still black with the heavily caked loam. The figure stood erect, as if on a hidden pedestal or altar. One arm was raised, caressing with a shapely hand the ripe contour of the bosom. The other, hanging idly, was still plunged in the earth. Digging deeper, the monks began to uncover the full voluptuous hips and rounded thighs, and finally, taking turns in the pit, whose rim was now higher than their heads, they came to the sunken pedestal, which stood on a pavement of granite. During the course of their excavations, as the nature of their find began to disclose itself unmistakably, the brothers had felt a strange, powerful excitement, whose cause they could hardly have explained, but which seemed to arise, like some obscure contagion, from the long-buried arms and bosom of the image. Mingled with a pious horror due to the infamous nudity and paganry of the feminine statue, there was an unacknowledged pleasure which the three would have rebuked in themselves as vile and shameful if they had recognized it. Oddly fearful of chipping or scratching the marble, they wielded their spades with much chariness, and when the digging was completed and the comely feet were uncovered on their pedestal, Paul, the oldest, standing beside the image in the pit, began to wipe away with a handful of weeds and grass the maculations of dark loam that still clung to its lovely body. This task he performed with great thoroughness, and he ended by polishing the marble with the hem and sleeves of his black robe. He felt an unwonted but delicious fever as he touched the smooth marble, and he lingered so long over a self-imposed task, and the movements of his rough hands were so lover-like and caressing, that they aroused the unspoken disapproval of Pierre and Hugh, who, nevertheless, were half conscious of a covert desire to follow his example. At length Paul emerged reluctantly from the pit. He and his fellows, who were not without classic learning, now saw that the figure was evidently a statue of Venus, dating no doubt from the Roman occupation of Aveyron, when certain altars to this divinity had been established by the invaders. The vicissitudes of half-legendary time, the long dark years of inhumation, had harmed the Venus little, if at all. The slight mutilation of an ear-tip, half hidden by rippling curls, and the partial fracture of a shapely middle toe merely served to add, if possible, a keener seduction to her languorously sensual beauty. She was exquisite as a succubi of youthful dreams, but her perfection was touched with inenarrable evil. The lines of the mature figure were fraught with a maddening luxuriousness. The eyelids were drooped in a pretended coyness of false virtue. The lips of the full Thracian face were half pouting, half smiling, with ambiguous allure. It was the masterpiece of an unknown decadent sculptor, not the noble maternal Venus of heroic times, but the sly and cruelly voluptuous Cotytto, the Cytherean of dark orgies, ready for her descent into the hollow hill. Staring at the fully revealed image, the good monks became forcibly aware of certain unhallowed emotions which they would never have been willing to avow. A sensuous enchantment, an amorous thraldom, seemed to flow from the pale-flesh marble and to weave itself like invisible hair about the hearts of the brothers. They felt the prompting of forbidden thoughts and reveries, of rebel desires which they had supposedly put away with the assuming of their monkhood. With a sudden mutual feeling of shame that caused them to avoid each other's eyes, they began to debate what should be done with the Venus, which, in a monastery garden, was somewhat misplaced and would become a source of embarrassment. Since their combined efforts would barely have sufficed to elevate the heavy image from the pit, they sent Hugh, as the youngest, to report their find to the abbot and await his decision regarding its disposal. In the meanwhile, Paul and Pierre resumed their garden labors, stealing covert glances at the fair head of the goddess, which was all that they could see in the deep hole at a little distance. Chapter 2. The discovery of the Venus was destined to become a cause of much excitement, perturbation, and even discussion amid the quiet brotherhood at Phrygian. Augustine, the abbot, came out in person to inspect the find, accompanied by many monks who were not engaged at that hour in some special task. Even the saintly abbot, in spite of his reverend age and rigorous temper, was somewhat discomfited by the peculiar witchery which seemed to emanate from the marble. Sternly he repressed his agitation, and gave no sign other than a deepening of the natural austerity of his demeanor. Curtly he ordered the bringing of ropes, and directed the raising of the Venus from her loamy bed to a standing position on the garden ground beside the hole. In this task Paul, Pierre, and Hugh were assisted by 2 others. After making sure that their lovely burden had been set firmly on her pedestal, the 5 brothers showed a singular inclination to tarry about the Venus. Many others now pressed forward to examine the figure closely, and several were even prompted to touch it, till rebuked for this unseemly action by their superior, who, if he felt a similar impulse, would not sacrifice his holy dignity by yielding to it. Certain of the elder and more severe Benedictines urged the immediate destruction of the image, which, they argued, was a heathen abomination that defiled the abbey garden by its presence, and therefore should not be countenanced. Others, moved by the evil beauty of the Venus in a manner impossible for them to admit, pleaded furtively and shamefacedly for her preservation. Still others, the most practical, pointed out that the Venus, being a rare and beautiful example of Roman sculpture, might well be sold at a goodly price to some rich and impious art lover. Augustine, though he felt that the Venus should be indubitably destroyed as an impure pagan idol, was filled with a queer and unaccountable hesitation, which led him to defer the necessary orders for her demolishment. It was as if the subtly wanton loveliness of the marble were pleading for clemency like a living form, with a voice half human, half divine. Averting his eyes from the white bosom, he spoke harshly, bidding the brothers to return to their labors and devotions, and saying that the Venus could remain in the garden till arrangements were made for her ultimate disposition and removal. Pending this, he instructed one of the brothers to bring sackcloth and drape therewith the unseemly nudity of the goddess. Even at the time, Augustine was criticized for his peculiar delay and laxness in this matter by some of the deans. During the few years that remained to him, he was to regret bitterly the flash of carnal weakness that had prompted him to defer the destruction of the image. Contenting himself for the nonce with a severe injunction to the effect that no one should approach the Venus other than those whose labors in the garden should compel an involuntary proximity, Augustine retired with the various brothers, some of whom, as they went, gave many a backward glance at the lifelike charms of the naked goddess. Later, there was much peeping from the cell windows that looked upon the garden, and more than one brother, caught in this indecorous occupation, was reprimanded austerely by the deans. However, such peccadillos were trivial indeed, compared with the grave scandal involving a number of the monks, which ensued shortly. Those concerned were Paul, Pierre, and Hugh, together with the two who had helped in raising the Venus from her pit, and 3 others who had also touched the limbs or body of the statue with their fingers. These 8, it was found, had absented themselves without leave from the monastery during the night that followed the discovery of the Venus. Covertly and shamefastly, several of them returned the next morning, and their fellow truants straggled in during the day, or were apprehended through rumors and charges that had been brought against them. All, it was learned, had been guilty of open or furtive lechery. Some had annoyed the peasant woman of the neighborhood with satyr-like advances. Others had played the incubus with village girls at Saint-Zenobie, or had been seen in houses of ill fame many miles away in Zeme. Summoned before their indignant abbot, these piacular culprits could offer no explanation or defense, other than the plea that they had been driven by an irresistible carnal compulsion. They attributed their downfall to the antique Venus, saying that they had been haunted by lubric thoughts and goaded by lascivious desires, such as had tormented Antony during his desert vigil, ever since the hour when they had touched the flesh-white marble of the statue. Many of those who had beheld the evil image, but had not touched it, now confessed that they had been conscious of like thoughts and impulses, and all agreed that a foul enchantment had been exerted by the Venus. Since only those who had laid hands on the marble were actually driven beyond the bounds of decorum or decency, it was plain that the full power of the diabolic pagan charm was inherent in such contact, and that anyone who dared to handle the Venus henceforth would be in grave danger of perdition. The whole situation, though supremely scandalous, was so unusual that it could not be dealt with in any ordinary fashion. In view of their sorcerous temptation and demoniac compulsion, the 8 offending monks were not expelled from the order, as their heinous lecheries might well have merited, but were merely sentenced to severe and protracted penance. In the meanwhile, nothing was done with the Venus, for obviously anyone who ventured to touch it, even perhaps with the motive of demolition, would court the baleful witchcraft that had already brought a profound and far-reaching evil on Phrygian. It was suggested that some laymen, to whom the penalty of heathen madness would be a less serious matter than to those who had taken vows of chastity, should be hired to shatter the idol and remove and bury its fragments. This, no doubt, would have been accomplished in good time if it had not been for the hasty and fanatic zeal of brother Louis. Chapter 3. This brother, a youth of good family, was conspicuous among the Benedictines both for his comely face and his austere piety. Handsome as Adonis, he was given to ascetic vigils and prolonged devotions, outdoing in this regard the abbot and the deans. At the hour of the statue's disinterment, he was busily engaged in copying a Latin testament, and neither then nor at any later time had he cared to inspect a find which he considered more than dubious. He had expressed disapprobation on hearing from his fellows the details of the discovery, and feeling that the abbey garden was polluted by the presence of an obscene image, he had purposely avoided all windows through which the womanly nakedness of the antique marble might have been visible to his chaste eyes. Therefore, it was with supreme horror and indignation that he learned of the downfall of the 8 Benedictines who had touched the image. It seemed to him an insupportable thing that these virtuous, God-fearing monks should be brought to shame through the operation of some carnal pagan spell. He reprobated openly the hesitation of Augustine and his delay in destroying the idol. More mischief, he felt, would ensue if it were suffered to remain intact, and were left to contaminate the beholders with its unchaste nudity. The act of demolition should be accomplished at once. Secure in his own consciousness of sanctity and virtue, and fearless of any temptation or baleful influence that might be exerted by the Venus, brother Louis, after long and painful reflection, resolved that he would take the matter into his own hands. Though this action would involve a nominal disobedience to the abbot's order, he would go forth that very evening, armed with a heavy hammer, and would smash the idol into many fragments. Thus the honor of Phrygian would be vindicated, and his insubordination become a justifiable thing. Brooding deeply as he went about his daily toils and devotions, Louis confided his intention to no one. Wild whispers were circulating among the monks, and it was said that several others besides the 8 culprits had been drawn to touch the sorcerous marble in secret, and would succumb anon to the overpowering nympholepsy which they had incurred. It was said also that the image was no mere lifeless lump of stone, but had sought to entice with wanton smiles and harlot gestures those who had labored in the garden after Paul, Pierre, and Hugh. Hearing these whispers, Louis was confirmed in his resolution. Visiting on some pretext or other the workshop of the abbey at twilight, he concealed an iron hammer beneath his robe and carried it away with him to his cell. Then, toiling patiently at the Latin manuscript by candlelight, while a holy wrath and ardor mounted within him, he waited till most of the brothers had retired to their dormitory. A rosy-tinted moon that was slightly past the full had climbed above the neighboring forest when Louis stole forth into the garden by a postern door. The blackish clods of freshly spaded loam were topped with an eerie silver, and Louis had not gone far on the open ground when he discerned the Venus, whose nude limbs and bosom startled him as if they had been those of a living woman. Indeed, as he went nearer, he could not persuade himself that the figure was a mere statue. The full, wan breasts appeared to quiver in the moonlight, as with the rise and fall of a breathing bosom. The drooping eyelids seemed to lift in a captious coquetry. The doubtfully smiling lips assumed a more seductive curve. The delicate fingers stirred a little, as if to beckon him. Aware, however, that this illusion might well be part of the baneful enchantment whose cause he had come forth to destroy, Louis strove to resist the insidious impressions that troubled him more and more. Sinking into the soft and thoroughly spaded soil at each step, he went boldly forward till he stood face to face with the Venus on the verge of the dark hole from which she had been exhumed. Without delay, with a feeling of imperative haste, he tried to lift the ponderous hammer, but it seemed that his arm, though sustained by a righteous anger, a holy indignation, would no longer obey him. He knew not how the change had been wrought, nor how the spell had fallen, but he felt the impotence of a dreamer, helpless in the thrall of some strange dream. A subtly clinging web was upon his senses. Wildly, with dying horror and rebellion, he stared at the immemorial temptress, who seemed to proffer her divine beauty. And staring, he forgot his wrath, his purpose, his fear and horror, and his cenobitic vows. The hammer fell unheeded from his fingers, bathed in a perilous light, and swathed with alluring shadows. The Venus appeared to live and palpitate, to lift comely hands that implored his mercy, to open fair eyes and delicious lips that claimed his love. An unleashed delirium, sudden and irresistible, sang triumphantly in his brain, exulted madly in his blood. Stepping across the forgotten hammer, he embraced the Venus. Her arms and bosom were cool as marble to his feverish touch, but they seemed to offer the firm softness and resilience of living flesh. Chapter 4. The absence of Brother Louis, together with that of 3 others, was noted by the monks at early dawn with much alarm and consternation. Sorrowfully, it was surmised that they had fallen under the spell of the statue, and would be apprehended in the same manner and for the same sinful deeds as their predecessors. Later, 2 of the missing monks returned to the abbey of their own will, and a 3rd was caught with the charcoal burner's wife, whom he had seduced into mad elopement. All made the same confession. Laboring in the garden on the previous day, they had been prompted by a fatal curiosity to finger the forbidden image, and had been seized, as a result, by the pagan madness. Brother Louis, however, was not found, and his fate remained a mystery for several hours. Then it happened that one of the older monks, on some errand or another, had occasion to cross the garden. Peering fearfully in the direction of the Venus, he was surprised and mystified to see that she had disappeared. With much trepidation, deeming the vanishment an act of sorcery or Satanry, he went forward to the place where the statue had stood. There, with unspeakable horror, he found the solution of the riddle. Somehow, the Venus had been overturned and fallen back into the huge pit. The body of Brother Louis, with a shattered skull and lips bruised to a bloody pulp, was lying crushed beneath her marble breasts. His arms were clasped about her in a stiff embrace, to which death had now added its own rigidity. And later, when the horrified brothers had been summoned to consider the problem, it was deemed inadvisable to make any effort toward his removal. The iron hammer, lying beside the pit, was proof of the righteous intention with which he had gone forth, but certain other matters, putting him beyond all redemption, were equally evident. So, by the order of Augustine, the pit was filled hastily to its rim with earth and stones, and the very spot where it had been, being left without mound or other mark, was quickly overgrown by grass and weeds, along with the rest of the abandoned garden.